We're going to do some appliques, and we're going to do a heart shape specifically because of the overall shape of a heart has points. It has this inside point here and an outside point. It also has curves. So the way in which you have to address all these different things are different. So you can draw a pattern, but always remember that you want to cut your final piece at least a quarter or no more than a quarter inch beyond the outside of the pattern. You're going to also then take it to the iron, and you're going to press the seam allowance down all the way around. Now you cannot press this inside point here. The fabric won't just turn over into this inside point. So you have to snip the inside point. So you are going to come here and you are going to take your scissor and you are going to snip into the point. I don't go all the way to the very edge of the fabric because the fabric's going to fray. But by snipping, you now can separate the fabric, and it now will turn, because without that it's just not going to be able to follow the shape. The other thing is, as you're snipping these curved edges, you've got more fabric than you have to put it in. So as with all cutting for patterns, when you have more fabric than will fit the curve, you snip a triangle. So as you can see here, you snip this triangle, and when you snip the triangle, you're taking away excess. Again, do not snip all the way to where the crease is. Stop short of the crease. But you can see here that by snipping that excess fabric away, the fabric is now actually going to lay flat, whereas on this side it's got these overlaps. So you can eliminate those overlaps by snipping these triangles of fabric away. Also on the bottom edge, when you're pressing, you're going to press down one end at this tip, and then make sure that when you press and turn the other end, that from the front you've got a nice clean point and you've got no extra thread coming from that extra point. There, you're going to attach your heart to your fabric, and there are different types of stitches that can be used. But in this first example, with a turned edge, I am going to be doing a blanket stitch. I take very small clean stitches, and I like to start on this pointed edge, again making sure that the fold on the back does not come through at all. So I'm going to take this very first stitch on the point. I'm using floss because with the floss I get a nice substantial stitch. In other words, the stitch is pretty visible. And remember that with your blanket stitch, the thread is behind your needle. So and you will notice that I just take very small little bites out of this fabric as I'm stitching along. So what it does is, in essence, I'm outlining this heart with the blanket stitch. I have it pinned in place so that it lands where I want it to land. there seemed to be a little bit of a catch there on my fabric. But it doesn't take very long at all to sew all the way around this heart. I do have the hem turned, so it's a finished edge, which means that it's very durable. It can go in the wash. It can go to the dry cleaners. This is not going to shift at all. This is here, and it's a very permanent stitch. So I'm just going to continue to follow the outside of this edge. Again, I do take small stitches. I like the work to be very clean. You could use longer stitch. In other words, you could come way up here if you'd like to, but that to me is a more kind of folksy kind of look, and that's not what I'm going for. Nothing wrong with that look. That's a choice. I'm really just wanting to have this very clean edge. The better you press the edges of the fabric, the easier your life is, because I'm not having to also turn. So over here, where it's not turned, I'm going to have to spend a little more time before I take a stitch, making sure that those edges are turned correctly. So because of the curves, the closer you do these stitches, the closer together, the more accurately you can follow the curve. If I was doing my stitches very far apart, this wouldn't look like a curve. I would have these points in the curve of my fabric. I wouldn't have a nice soft curve. So keep in mind that the way you do these stitches and the distance between the stitches affects the look as well. So as you can see here, I have to spend a little bit of time making sure that my fabric is turned before I can take a stitch. In other words, if you've pressed this nice and flat, it is harder for the curved edges to stay flat. There are glues that you can glue this down with. In fact, you can use a stick glue. Those are quite acceptable. I have a stick glue as part of my sewing kit. And for things like this, I would just stick glue it down, make sure, of course, it's dry. And the stick glue doesn't affect the fabric. It doesn't stain the fabric. It's never going to show. You won't know that you used it. So it's just an Elmer's stick glue. They make stick glue for sewing, but I've not used that. Again, I just use the Elmer's. You can buy stick glue though that is meant for sewing. I've never had any trouble with the Elmer's staining my fabric or somehow migrating into my fabric. I'm making sure that this stitch falls right into that point here, so I'll take a smaller stitch in order for it to do that before I come back around. So I made sure that my bottom stitch here fell in that point, and my top stitch here falls in my point as well. And then I just continue. I hold my thread with my thumb, that way the thread will always be under the needle, and I'll have that knot rather than the thread being forward and then I have to turn it. I turn it ahead of making my stitch. And as you can see, this actually goes very, very, very quickly. This is the blanket stitch here on the heart, and I will just continue to sew, and we will catch up at the other end. Wow. So as we come here to the end, be sure that you have this, if your fold underneath is showing through, make sure that it gets tucked away before you do those last stitches. You don't want any of that to actually show from the front side. So I'm taking, again, I'll take a couple more little bites, and I will make sure I take one here to secure that, and then I'm just going to knot from the back side so it's nice and clean, and just do a nice double knot like I always do. I pull it through once. Oops, I went through only one of my threads here. Pull it through a second time, and we are all finished. And that's the applique with the buttonhole stitch. Okay, so this stitch is a visible stitch. This stitch is meant to be here and to show. It is a stitch that outlines your work and it shows. It's an element of the final design.